Thanks, Geraldine, and thanks everyone for coming today. Asad, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Where are you joining us from? Are you based in London?
I am in East London. Yes,
East
London.
London, very good, very good. Well, look, thanks for joining us today. NIPSA Youth. I don't know how much you know, but NIPSA is the largest trade union here in Northern Ireland for public service workers and civil service workers, and we're joined today by members and officers and staff and all sorts. And it's great to see us all here. So obviously today's topic, COVID, climate crisis, and the need for a Green New Deal is a huge issue. It's a global issue. It's one that's being hotly debated throughout every political party in Parliament that's out there. And I think we're just really interested to hear your take on it and more on Want's analysis of where we're at. It's obviously scary times. And if we think that the current crisis that we're going through, the COVID crisis and the economic crisis that both preceded it and is being fed by it, it's the climate crisis, which I don't know if you've seen it. It's there's a great cartoon. It's sort of like the economic crisis is a wave, the COVID crisis is a bigger wave, and then the climate crisis is like a tsunami heading towards us. So there's nothing more for me to say. There'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. So Asad, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you, Adam and Geraldine, for this kind invitation to come and join you this afternoon. And just say how I'm always really pleased to be invited by NIPSA and solidarity greetings to NIPSA Youth. I've I think taken part in a couple of different NIPSA seminars and talks, and I know my predecessor John also did. And I just want to first start by just saying how much as War on Want we value NIPSA, and you've been an affiliate of War on Want for I'm told for nearly 35 years, and very much a core part of War on Want's family, and you've been, you know, supported our work and that of our partners around the world, and we really value that relationship and all the work that you do. Also, just to say congratulations to you on, I understand, the establishment of the Global Solidarity Committee. I think it's a real recognition that the trade union movement has a much wider agenda than, of course, dealing with the very important day-to-day issues of its members. And I think it reflects really the role that the labour movement has played throughout history in being really at the centre of movements for social justice, both at a national and at a global level. And we all know without the labour movement, we would not have had the victories and enjoy some of the protections that are so much under threat today, from around workers' rights, the 8-hour day, sick pay, safety at work, etc. But the trade union movement has always had a vision that's gone well beyond that. You know, I mean, just in recent times, we can say clear, you know, without the trade union movement, the struggle against apartheid wouldn't be won. When trade unionists were being murdered in Chile or currently being murdered in Colombia, it's the trade union movement that, you know, is at the forefront of acting in solidarity and, you know, and providing that kind of practical solidarity. And I know from my own experience of being in the anti-racist movement that the trade unions were often the first to offer us practical support and continue to be at the forefront of that important struggle. And I think we, as Adam said, we're at a moment when so it's gone beyond like as an academic exercise. People recognize that the issues we face are global in nature, you know, and they affect all of us. And that recognition of, you know, whilst it might be news to some people, I've always believed it's not news to the trade union movement, because that internationalism has always been at its heart. Whenever I look at trade union banners, you know, I see that slogan, workers of the world unite, you know, and it's because workers have always understood the importance of both solidarity, of building power, and also that, you know, fighting for a fair and just world doesn't end at the factory gate. And, you know, and I think that that internationalism of that vision of saying, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all is speaks to that vision that we are all connected and our goal is a justice for all people. And it's why, you know, the labour movement founded War on Want, and even to this day that we remain rooted within the labour movement. We have all the major trade unions and countless branches and workplaces as affiliates of War on Want, and really proud to count NIPSA as one of those. So if you don't know about War on Want, let me just very briefly say a few words. War on Want is, I would say, the leading organisation here in the UK in the fight against the root causes of global poverty and human rights violations. We work in a very, very different way. We create global partnerships with grassroots social movements, with trade unions and workers' organizations to empower people from the bottom upwards to fight for their rights. But we also run really hard-hitting campaigns to raise awareness and build our collective strength around addressing these root causes, and for people to be able to believe that they do and can take action for change. And over the last 65 years of War on Want, we've pretty much been at the forefront of all of the major struggles in, I won't go back over decades, but even since the 1980s, we established the sort of groundbreaking campaigns around third world debt. We were the first charity to run a campaign around that. We were the first to become the advocates of a Tobin tax on currency speculation. And today we continue to really focus on the systemic structures that create poverty, inequality and climate injustice. And we really believe that it's the radical changes that people and science demand can't take place within this neoliberal economic system that is so clearly putting profit before people and planet. So, as I said, we campaign alongside movements and alongside trade unions, and both in the UK and globally. And one of the trade campaigns that we've been very proud to support is, of course, around low-paid workers in the UK, particularly the McStrikers. But alongside that, also garment workers in the global south. We also support very practically frontline communities in literally every corner of the world, fighting resource exploitation, fighting for the right to food and food sovereignty, fighting against militarization, occupation, and of course against the corporations that act with such impunity, that dodge their tax, that wreak havoc on people's lives, and on the trade systems that enable that to take place. One of the campaigns we're running very much at the moment and very salient because of what's going on in the US, of course, is the US-UK trade deal, which threatens our public services, our NHS, workers' rights, our food safety, climate. And of course, it's in a trade agreement that at its centre puts the interests of business ahead of those of people. Now, I was asked today to speak about COVID, climate, the economic crisis, and why we need a global Green New Deal. And just as I was joining it reminded me of this quote. COVID is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free market can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, the myth that we're all in the same boat. Now, listening to that, you think, I wonder which radical trade union leader said that, right? I wonder who in the global south said that. Those are the words of the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, in a speech he made last month. And I think it speaks to the seismic change that is taking place as more and more people realize that what we're talking about are not separate issues, but an interconnected system that is failing people. And so that very much sits at the heart of this discussion about the multiple crises that we face. And there are many different dimensions we could discuss, and maybe in the discussion we can touch on those. But I think the reality is we can all see, the broken world we had has been fractured even more in the last few months. It's often said that the corona pandemic has been an X-ray on our societies, exposing all the deep racial, economic and social inequalities that exist. And, I think for the Labour movement, they've always well recognised that. Maybe it's news for some, but it's clearly not news for people, for the poorest, and it's clearly not news for people in the global south who've been living on these front lines of injustice. And of course, in recent months, we've also seen this explosion of anger around the Black Lives Matter movement as it's taken to the streets, sparked by George Floyd's desperate plea, I can't breathe. And that plea, it's a cry that is really, connects so much as well, because it echoes through the ages, in the resistance to slavery and colonialism, to the call around climate, and of course today around COVID and neoliberal inequality. And it's really a cry that I've always understood it as that's a cry against the injustices that say the lives of some people simply don't matter, that the lives of the poorest people, of people in the global south, and the poorest even in our own societies, are either disposable or expendable. But at the same time, it's also a call for action, because it's a call for action that tries to connect our struggles in our workplace to the community, both at a local, national and global level. So I want to see today as an opportunity for discussing how does our call address all of these permanent crises that are faced by the poorest, not just from the corona pandemic or the existing crisis of neoliberal inequality, the global recession, the crisis of racism and patriarchy, but also the climate crisis. So I'm just going to start with the corona pandemic because, of course, it's on our TV screens as we speak about, the likelihood of entering another national lockdown. And as cases spike across the UK, and I know also there in Northern Ireland. Look, globally, we've well surpassed over 1 million dead. Millions and millions and more are now hospitalized cases, and those that are surviving, we're now learning, are living with life-changing health issues. And it's no surprise that these have been the poorest in the global south who've been the hardest hit. It's the very people who lack access to social protection, meaning that the millions who struggle to survive each day have no option but continue to try and make an income. There's no sick pay, no welfare system. And we have to remember that 70% of all the workers in the global south are in the informal economy. But even those that are in the formal economy haven't fared any better. You might remember those, and they were on our TV screens. You've seen the images of workers in the garment industry, for example, left destitute when factory gates were shut, and our high street brands refusing to pay them. And, we have partners, trade unions in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, who've had to call on War on Want to help them provide emergency humanitarian assistance, food parcels to their own members to prevent them and their families from starving. And even when factories have been reopened, as we've just seen in Sri Lanka, workers aren't working, of course, in safe and secure workplaces. Infection rates are exploding in these unsafe workplaces. And where there is an infection, what we see is authoritarian governments, state authorities are rounding workers up at gunpoint and detaining them in camps, like we've seen at this moment with garment workers in Sri Lanka. And the reality is, of course, this is coming on top of inequality that has condemned half the world's population to live on $5 a day, and where every single shock that happens pushes people who are literally barely surviving into not surviving at all. And I know we're often told by our governments, we're told by the international institutions, we should celebrate that poverty is falling, but poverty is only falling if you look at extreme poverty, which basically means just not dying at $1.90. But if you look at the poverty at $5 a day, the reality is that figure hasn't changed since 1990. We all know now, during Corona, the importance of housing. Yet we have a world where 1.6 billion people lack even basic housing. And those that are, and many billions more, are living in overcrowded homes where they don't even have basic amenities. And just as we've seen here in the UK, it's been the poorest, those who are living week to week, those in multi-generational homes that are being hit the hardest. And even then, during the midst of the pandemic, we've seen governments all around the world use this opportunity to target some of the poorest communities. One of our partners is a union of shack dwellers, Abashali in Southern Africa, whose members, lack water, sanitation, electricity, the very basic things that are needed during this corona pandemic and lockdown, whose leaders have been targeted for assassination, and its communities violently evicted so that the land could be taken over by private developers, even in the midst of the pandemic, who want to build for profit. And if we see the response to this global pandemic, I think it provides us an insight to what the response has been to other global crises, and of course, the upcoming climate crisis, and how that will just reinforce all of the economic inequalities. Because what did we see when the pandemic first struck? We saw a competition between rich and poor countries for access to health resources. We saw the reality that your health and economic inequalities determine your survival rates. And of course, whilst we have many criticisms of governments in the global north, the governments in the global north ripped up their rule book on austerity, ripped up their neoliberal financial rules, and invested in their economy to protect their economy and their citizens. The very tools that have been denied countries in the global south because of the structural adjustment programs that we as in our government and our global institutions have have imposed. So much so that 46 countries of the global south have no health system at all, where many more have one bed for their whole population. Now, it's calculated in Germany there are 42 doctors per 10,000 of the population. In the UK, we do much worse than that. We're about 28. And we have allies in Sierra Leone where the ratio is 0.2 doctors per 10,000. And that's not by accident. That's because a decade ago, the IMF insisted that Sierra Leone cut its public expenditure and cut its investments into health, so much so, and privatise those systems. And it's now left 64 countries of the lowest income countries in the world who are spending more on debt servicing than their health systems. On average, they're spending close to about 7.8% of their total GDP on debt and about 1.8% on public health. We have 100 countries who currently are going to be paying 130 billion in debt service in this alone. And when we put that into perspective, since 1980 to now, that debt repayment for debts that haven't been at the interests of people is now calculated to be at roughly around 4.5 trillion that has been paid to banks and private companies in the north. And I don't know if you saw the pictures of Ecuador during the lockdown, but in Ecuador, there had been so many cuts being made to public services that the dead were lying unburied in the street. But Ecuador was paying debt service to banks and to global corporations, and was being applauded by the global community for saying, isn't Ecuador really great because it's not reneging on its debt, it's fulfilling its obligations, whilst at the same time, incredibly, municipalities were being overwhelmed with the number of debt. And of course, we all know the worst is yet to come. The upcoming recession, and of course that recession that's already hit many parts of both the global north and the south, is going to lead, it's estimated now that it could lead up to half of all jobs in the global south will go. The ITC just recently estimated that something like 420 million jobs have been lost. And the World Bank said that close to 300 million more people are going to be plunged into extreme poverty. And as I said, extreme poverty in their line is around $1.90 a day. And that is not surviving. All UN indicators say that if you want the basic level, not to have enough to feed your family, to have a house over your head, a roof over your head, to be able to have your children in education and be able to have access to health, you would need at least an income of between $10 to $15 a day. So just that disparity between the reality of where already people are. And of course, in the midst of all this, incredibly, corporations and right-wing governments are already pushing governments to roll back hard-won labour rights in the name of competitiveness and rebuilding the economy. You've probably heard this slogan, fire and rehire. And that's what's happening in so many places where companies are firing workers on their current contracts and then rehiring them on weaker contracts. In India, decades-old workers' rights that have been won by the trade union movement are being ripped up. In other countries, big businesses are already demanding for governments that they should have special zones where corporations don't pay any tax, where minimum wage laws don't apply, and where even labour unions aren't recognised. And the problem is, for many of the poorest countries, they're being left with no choice but to do that. Because when the pandemic struck and the global south needed desperate support, the IMF, again, not the most radical organization in the world, estimated that the global south would need about 2.2 trillion just to deal with the COVID pandemic, not anything else, just to deal with the COVID pandemic. And the reality is that what they've been offered is more debt creating loans. And already the IMF has said that those loans and debt postponements that are taking place at the moment will need to be repaid. And that there will need to be a new wave of global austerity and a cutting back of public expenditure. And of course, we know what that means in terms of public services and support. And, that's not, of course, not just a story in the global south. We all see the story here, who's not been moved by, of course, the fact that 1 million people have signed Marcus Rashford's petition, and that fact that we're living in an economy, the 6th richest economy in the world, and yet we have 4 million people using food banks, where millions of children are going hungry. Why? Because millions of people are trapped in low pay, insecure work, 0-hour contracts, and the welfare cuts that we've seen over the last decade have meant that of those people in poverty, 70% of them are in work poverty, where they come from households where one or more people are working. And, and again, one of the slogans of War on Want has always been poverty is political, right? The poverty is not a natural state, it's a result of political decisions. And we saw that with the UN report into the UK last year, which said, the reason why there are extreme levels of poverty and destitution in the UK is a result of government policies. And it talked about it said this could be eradicated by increasing the minimum wage to a living wage, by increasing child benefit. It laid out a raft of policy measures, many of which are, of course, what the trade union movement has long called for. And even if, and I know this moment looks bleak and there is a conversation, well, when the vaccine comes, maybe everything will be all right, and it's what's incredible at the moment, even if all of the vaccines that are currently being tested are all successful, what's already happened is that the big pharmaceuticals have already allocated over 50% of those vaccines to the richest countries. So 13% of the world's population has already bought up 50% of vaccines. And what they've said to poorer countries is that you will have to pay for those vaccines. And what's incredible about that is, that the total cost of distributing a vaccine to absolutely everybody in the world would only cost us $70 billion, which is about 0.59% of the cost of COVID to the global economy, and a fraction of the money that is being handed out in corporate bailouts all around the world. And we know that the corporate bailouts overwhelmingly have gone to big fossil fuel companies, to airlines, to the very polluting industries that we see. So I say that because, of course, COVID is there, but within that, I think it's also a moment of hope, right? Because there is increasingly a realization amongst citizens in the global north about the importance of public services, about, how low pay affects people, about why governments need to be investing in stimulus packages to rebuild their economies. And that does provide us with an opportunity to demand sort of some deep systemic demands to tackle both the COVID crisis and the global recession. Because, one thing to remember about this recession, for those of us who were, active in the last financial recession and saw what the reality of that decade of austerity did, both to the fabric of our societies and communities here, is this recession is not going to be answered by a recapitalizing of the bank. This is a much bigger and deeper fissure in the global economy. And already there are two choices that are being put forward. There is a choice that we can build back in a more sustainable way. And people talk about a green stimulus, they talk about green deals, they talk about all of those. All what we're going to see is a new wave of supercharged austerity to be able to repay the debt that is being amassed by northern governments. Now, I just want to move quickly onto the climate crisis. Now, again, it's been a long time since anybody needed to be a bloody climate scientist to know that the climate crisis is not an existential crisis. It's here, it's real, and it's affecting millions of people. Switch on your television screens on any given day, and you'll see the pictures of killer floods, fires, droughts taking place. We already can see the supercharged hurricanes. Oh, we know that every single year the records are being broken. The most powerful hurricanes, the most powerful cyclones, the highest temperature rates. And of course, all of those have a human cost. We saw last year in Chennai, in India's 5th biggest city, the whole city ran out of fresh water, and it's now predicted that 40% of India's 1.2 billion population will be without access to fresh water within the coming decades, which will have an immense impact on food production and, of course, on poverty and inequality. We saw the effect of one storm on Dominica, the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. One storm wiped out Dominica's GDP by 246%. Now, those numbers, they just look like, what's that 240? Then when we look at what that number means, it basically means every hospital, every school, every public institution, the roads, the fabric of that country wiped out in one single storm. And the story is the same everywhere in the world. And it's not, and it's overwhelming countries already. We can already see the cost of the climate crisis is immense. Now, the global community, has said we have to keep temperatures well below 1.5 degrees. Now, often quite naturally, you hear that 1.5 degrees, you think, God, that doesn't sound like much, does it? On a cold wintry day, I whack up my thermometer way more than that on my heating system. And I want to go to warm countries where, we're at 28, 29 degrees. I think just worth bearing that's, of course, an average temperature. And what we mean at 1 degree, for example, where we are at the moment, which is causing all of this havoc in the world, is that in places, particularly in the global south, that means 8 times that. So it's an 8-degree warming that we've seen. And to put that into perspective, where we are now, the difference between where the world we live in now and the ice age, can you know what the difference in temperature is between the world we live in now and the ice age? It's 3 degrees. That is the amount of difference between going from an ice age to going to this world that we live in. We have absolutely no idea of what the world will look like if we're at 2 degrees, 3 degrees. We do know from all the scientific projections that they talk about that this will be a collapse in food production, that we will see millions of people displaced from their homes. We'll see large parts of the world inhospitable. So much so that the UN Special Rapporteur actually said, we are creating a climate apartheid where the rich will seek haven behind, using technology behind the clothes and try and escape rising sea levels. And it will be the poorest who face heat, exhaustion, extreme weather, etc. And we see that reality. We can see that reality of how climate impacts reinforce all of the existing economic and social inequalities that exist. Now, again, sometimes we say, okay, so that's an existential crisis. It's a big one. Maybe we've got to do something, right? That's about mid-century, right? Now, the reality is that even of what the climate scientists have told us, that the budget that we have, the carbon budget, the amount of pollution that we're allowed to expend into the atmosphere before we breach the 1.5 degree threshold is about 350 gigatons. That is a 1 in 3 chance. So, just again, putting that into perspective, none of us would ever get on a bus or a train if they said at the beginning, there's a 1 in 3 chance that this train will crash. But that's what most of our climate modeling is doing. It's saying there's a 1 in 3 chance that we're not just going to breach the 1.5, that we'll breach 2 degrees and 2.5 degrees. But if you took just that carbon budget, if we continue to emit at the scale that we're doing, we will have used that carbon budget within 9 years. So the scale of, we've got this incredible crisis of going on of COVID. We've got this global recession taking place where the millions of people are being forced out of work and left in destitution. And then we've got this incredible climate crisis, which will compound all of these existing crises. And it feels like despair, doesn't it? It feels like there is no solution to this current crisis. What do we do? But actually there is one, because, one of the things I think that neoliberalism did to all of us, it stole our ability to imagine something different. And if we've got to remember, as Milton Friedman, the architect of neoliberalism, very famously said it's in a moment of crisis that real change takes place. And he said, speaking to Conservatives, our job is to have the policies ready so so that we can make the politically impossible the politically practical. And I think that's where we are at the moment. Our question is how do we resolve these three big crises at the same time? And how do we do them in a way that is fair and just? Now, there are some people who argue, well, you know, it's so immense, we have to just think about our own economies. You know, let's think about our green stimulus package. How will we, you know, rebuild our economy? How do we invest in green technologies? Now, of course, you know, those all come at a cost. Those come at a material cost. You can't invest in green technology without requiring a huge level of extraction of metals and minerals, which ironically are responsible for about 30% of global emissions. So the very moment that we're going to try and tackle the climate crisis by going for green technology, we'll be increasing carbon emissions because we'll be mining more. And we'll be mining more at a time when we know we have to decrease energy use globally by 60%. At the same time, as we need to increase energy by 60% because we've got half the world's population who don't currently have access to electricity or clean cooking. So how do we do that? It feels like it's a conundrum, but actually there are scientific studies now being done saying we can provide energy, enough energy for public services, for housing, for heating, for food, to guarantee everybody in the world access to energy. We can power our transport systems. We can give everybody a dignified life. And not only can we give everybody who exists now, we can give up to 10 billion people that same quality of life. But what it requires is a much more profound conversation around what is energy for, what is productive energy, what is useful energy, what is the economy for, why are we producing goods that aren't necessary? And of course, that gets into a much bigger conversation. It's a conversation we're all starting to have, which is, what is our economy for? If it's not serving people, if it's not delivering people the very basic needs, is it that growth has been a beneficial thing? Or do we need to rethink our economy and start to think about a well-being economy, which prioritizes investment in care, in public services, in social services? And I think this is where the Global Green New Deal really comes to its own. Because we, as War on Want, we've been working with our partners all around the world on, you know, how do we address all these multiple crises and all of these challenges at the same time? You know, what are the kind of interventions we need? What are the kind of demands that we have? And how do we avoid that we fight each fight in a silo, separate from each other? So that if we fight for public services, we're fighting that without understanding or connecting with the fight around climate. Or if we're fighting around climate, we are not thinking about economic inequality. And, you know, it's said, and I'm a great believer, I don't know if you remember the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests protest in France a couple of years ago. You know, they had on the front of their banner, they had a slogan, which I think, you know, should sit in the heart of all social movements. It said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. So we all know that the scale of this transition that we need needs to answer those two things. It needs to deliver to where people are now, and it needs to be able to meet these big, huge existential crises. Now, it's possible to do that. It's possible for us to demand a global living wage for people and workers all throughout all supply chains. It is possible for us to deliver a global NHS, put access to public health. It's possible for us to have social protection. There is no obstacle in terms of the financial ability to be able to do it. We know full well there are the resources to be able to do it. We know we have the technology and the capacity to be able to do it. So we know that we can tackle the root causes of global inequality. But interestingly, when you look at the climate crisis and you look at the impacts of the climate crisis, what comes at the forefront of all the studies done of people who are affected by the climate crisis? the things that make a difference between whether people live or die, or whether make a difference between whether people are displaced from their homes is, do you have access to any services? Can you access health? Do you have income coming in? Do you have any social protection? All of the very things, the solutions that you need for tackling global inequality end up being the exact same solutions that you need to tackle the climate crisis. And lo and behold, they're the same demands that you need to meet this corona pandemic. And when you look at energy and food, the fact that we've got 2 billion people in the world going hungry, but yet we produce 3 times the amount of food that's needed in the world. How is this conundrum happening? It's happening because the majority of the world, 80% of the world's population, are only being fed on less than 24% of land. The rest of the land is being used for commodity exports, not for feeding and meeting the needs of people, either in the global north or in the global south. So we can feed people. We can feed people 3 times over, but it means reimagining what food is and how important, and is food a right? And should we demand that food, like energy, should be a public good, shouldn't be there to be exploited for profit, but should be there to serve and meet the needs of people? Suddenly we start to create an architecture of around a global Green New Deal that tackles global inequality, that tackles the food pandemic, the hunger pandemic, and the corona pandemic. And then we get to, well, what do we need to do about the architecture of our global economy? Because often we said, how do we pay for this? How do we pay for all of these things? Well, we've seen with the corona pandemic, there's been no shortage of printing of money. Nobody, I mean, you know, governments have been printing money without any restriction. Of course, they've been giving most of their money to the central banks, and the central banks have been lending them to big corporations, and most of the big corporations have actually been using the money to pay dividends to their shareholders, and not to actually support their own workers or invest in the new economy that we need. But there's one salient point that I always come back to, that during the corona pandemic, whilst the ordinary people have got poorer and poorer, the one set of people whose wealth has increased have been the extreme wealthy, whose wealth has increased by 1/3 just this year. And they, like people like Jeff Bezos, who's worth $189 billion now, you know, who makes $215 million a day, so much so that an average Amazon worker would need to work 24 hours a day for 68 years just to earn what Bezos earns in 1 hour. We can do that. We can impose wealth taxes. We can reverse corporation taxes. We can undo the mantra of what's happened with neoliberalism for the last 10 years, which has said that the market reigns supreme, that actually the answer to our economy is forced privatization, is unfettered corporate power, is a small state, is cuts to welfare system, and a deregulated labor economy. We now realize all of those things are the very same things that have led us to being unable to deal with the corona pandemic. And they're the very same things that fuel the inequality crisis. And of course, they're the solution to how we can transform our conversation around the green stimulus or the Green New Deal away from being an environmental issue to actually being an issue around justice. And for that, the labour movement needs to be at its heart. Because when we talk about just transition, we shouldn't be just talking about just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry. We should be talking about a justice transition that benefits all workers, that benefits all communities. Because as I said at the beginning, the labour movement are the champions of internationalism. The labour movement are the people who understand that our fights aren't won and fought only within the nation state, but they're won and fight at a global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asa. I mean, that was amazing. It really was. I mean, you just touched on so many different points in such a concise way, and I think provided a really compelling narrative that draws together all of these different aspects of and shows that they're not just draws them together, but actually points that they are all interlinked, and that they shouldn't be approached either in a topic by topic silo, such as, you know, when dealing with green energy or tackling poverty or world hunger or these different things, that they are already interconnected, and also that they're that we shouldn't try and deal with them nation by nation, but rather in a global and a global solidarity sort of sense. I'm just going to throw it open, I suppose, if anyone has any questions or comments. I mean, I have so much. I could talk for ages, but does anyone else have anything you want to, if you just put your hand up, or if you put in the chat, or because I can't see some people, but, and if not, then I'm gonna jump in myself. So no. Okay, well, I mean, I would just I took copious notes throughout all of this. One of the things I think that you mentioned quite early on was the way that COVID exposes certain fallacies about the world that we live in, and there are so many that have popped up since the COVID crisis began. I mean, one, for example, is within the European Union, we started to see nation compete against nation for the gathering of PPE, and I think a lot of the periphery nations of the European Union, such as Italy and Greece and others, suddenly they didn't feel a lot of love coming from the center, from France and Germany, as they had to compete with each other. Similarly, when you look at the United States, which is a civilization in its own right, the competition between the states, the cities, the governors, the mayors, and their federal government was shocking. And in fact, in one interview, a state governor said that he had personally purchased private protection equipment from another country, had it shipped to his state, and had put the National Guard on it to protect it. And when the interviewer said, protected from who? He said, the federal government, who might come and try and take it off me, but I'm keeping it for my state citizens. Within our own island of Ireland, we've seen the fallacy of having two different health systems, I think, one public, one private, and two different policies, where an arbitrary line in the road along the border meant that pubs on one side are closed, but pubs on the other side are not closed. That doesn't make any sense. And as you rightly pointed out, the billionaires just continue to get fatter and fatter, richer and richer. And there's something I read a while ago. It's that every day the sun goes up is a day that people like Jeff Bezos and the other billionaires choose not to work on solving these problems, because they have the money, they have the connections, they have the political power, and they just choose not to. I mean, I could say a lot more, but does anyone else have any comments or thoughts? I mean, is anyone here on the Global Solidarity Committee? Chris, sorry, did you want to come in there? Just make sure you unmute.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I'm Chris Bailey, so I'm the Vice Chair of the Youth Committee. Thank you very much, Asad, for your presentation. Just to sort of highlight on the youth issues, we're doing a manifesto at the minute, and one of the areas in that is young people and how social media influences current events. So one of the facets that you talk about, COVID being an X-ray is what you said on all the injustices, but young people are facing things like an increase in suicide, and we've got things like the polarization that social media is causing. So even in those areas that have the global issues, such as the basic housing and amenities that you talked about, those people are increasingly on social media, and we've seen an increase in sort of AI and ad-based targeting, which causes this polarization. And there's a lot of issues there with self-esteem. So does Warren want to have any campaign issues that highlight around the young people and how technology is going to impact that on the future? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And I should say also, my hope, and I'm always an optimistic person, but my real hope comes from the youth organizations and the youth movements, because I think they have, over the last few years, really shown how you have an intersectional approach to these issues of injustice. They don't see that the climate fight is separate from their fight around racial injustice, around gender justice, sexuality. They see that these are all systems and how things are connected. And And I take a great heart from the fact that when you look even a couple of years ago with the young people who came out on the climate strikers, many of those were the same people who came out on Black Lives Matter. Many of those are the same people who instinctively understand that they are part of this global movement and global thing. On technology, I mean, it's a really fascinating, you know, Warren Want has this, we've worked for many, many years on, particularly on, you know, sort of securitization, on militarization, on arms companies, etc., and how, you know, they export you know, the weaponry, how it impacts people, how it's not benefiting the workers in those industries. And, you know, for a long time, of course, you know, people have always understood that as being like, oh, well, that's just like the bombs, right? That's the bombs and things like that. What we're seeing actually now is this new wave of, and I think it's tech is really central to that in terms of both at the arm of securitization. So if you look at, for example, you know, I mean, we all now look at, you know, Donald Trump and we say, oh, look at it, what he says about build the wall, build the wall. But what's really fascinating about that call of build the wall was 20 years ago, the Pentagon did a report on what were going to be the crisis facing the US. And it said its number one crisis was going to be climate and its impacts. And it said the key, and it identified and it said, we will be faced with waves of unwanted migrants from the Caribbean, Mexico, and Latin America. And our only answer is to have more securitization of our borders. And the Pentagon budget for border walls and their whole doubled within 3 years. And what you see is this happening all around the world, not just physical borders, but how technology is being used as the new wave and the new frontier. So you've seen facial recognition, you've seen how, you know, we do work with the Palestinian people, how some of the technologies that are used there are now being exported all around the world because governments themselves know there is a crisis and there is an explosion happening. Now, you know, before COVID seems like such a long time ago that most of our memories have all gone. Like, we can't remember what January was like, right? But if you remember January, you know, there were huge protests taking place in Chile, which of course have been now successful in the constitution, around this is not about 30 pence or 30 pesos, it's about 30 years and about the structural issues. But at the same time, there were protests going on in Iraq, in Sudan, in Algeria, all around the world, huge protests about social inequality and political inequality. And all of those protests, yeah, they might have been dampened by COVID, but everybody knows they're bubbling again. And when this recession happens, they bubble. And what is the state's response going to be? Already you see that the states are saying, many authoritarians are saying, the response is going to have to be more securitization, more use of technology, more militarization. So not necessarily just like weapons, but actually how technology will feature increasingly. And technology is also placing itself as saying, look, we're the solution. I mean, it's a really paradox moment that we live in where they say, you don't need these services anymore. You don't need a state. We as the corporations will be able to provide them. And you see that when you look at what Amazon, what Google, what all of them are talking about in their internal conversations. They talk about their platforms becoming not just providing like material things to us, but actually providing the services, so overtaking the state. Now, within that, we know that technology has been a double-edged sword, because in one way, it's connected all of us, and at the same time, it's also driven some of the most poisonous discourse, and it's poisoning our politics, and it's undermining our democracy. How do we deal with that, and what its impacts? And as Chris, as you're right, said, you know, one of the impacts is this incredible spike in suicides and self-harm that we see. That's not just here in the global north, but also actually in the global south. And it's been a longer pattern, because when people feel this sense of alienation, feel powerless in the face of all of these things, without a state, without the very services that you as NIPSA, you know, the importance of social services or public services that make interventions into people's well-being. Without all of those, then often it is, you know, self-harm and suicide. And there's an incredible statistics from India that showed that just in terms of farmers, because of what's happened in terms of the corporate takeover of farming by Monsanto and others, and the control of their seeds. 250,000 farmers have committed suicide. That works out at something like, since they started calculating, it's like 3 farmers, like every minute, are committing suicide because they're trapped into this into debt and don't see any way out, and then are committing to. And it's an issue that not many people really talk about, which is the human cost, both in our well-being and our mental state, but also the reality of what all of these injustices happen. A couple of days ago, I was asked to talk on doing some media on, response to the free school meal stuff. And as somebody who grew up using free school meals, I find it really fascinating that when I started talking about it, how traumatic it felt, right? How that experience of poverty, of the stigma of free school meals. And I was listening to somebody talking. They said, that experience isn't about just not having food. It's so traumatic that it affects your whole body, and you live with it for the rest of your life. So you're absolutely right. I think so when we talk, and in just bringing it back to the Global Green New Deal, that's why we say what we've got to really have a conversation about is what economy comes next. What does a care economy actually look like? How do we put well-being of people at the center stage? How do we make sure that we value that rather than GDP as the indicators? And I think within that conversation is very much the points that you're talking about, Chris.
Thanks, Asad. We have a couple of people who've indicated as well they have questions. Carmel Gates, who's a current Deputy General Secretary of the Union, former President. Carmel, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Adam, and thank you, Asad, and obviously as well to Geraldine for organising this, because I think it is very timely and very welcome. And I have to say it's odd listening to you, Asad, in this type of environment, because when you finished, I think we all wanted to do a huge big clap, and it feels weird to have such an excellent contribution and kind of land flat in this environment. But I have to say that I found your contribution compelling and indisputable and logical in terms of the progression of how you took your arguments right through. So I have to say, hats off to you. That was really terrific. And you know what, it's full of lessons, because I mean, we are in a situation now that, to some degree has been inevitable for a number of years, as we know. I mean, it's been inevitable since the crash, the economic crash in 2008, and more annoying because the lessons that we learned from that, and the fact that we knew that austerity measures don't work, that austerity measures make things worse. I mean, for us as trade unionists and socialists, it's so much more annoying that we are this far further on, and as you say, the rich have just got richer, that we know the austerity agenda has failed, even in relation to government's own intentions. I mean, British government, Tories have been talking for years, they want to, reduce the deficit, and they continue to create and espouse policies that do anything but. They pay lip service to taking children out of poverty, and all of that. So, I mean, the short-sightedness and the pure greed, not just of Bezos and people like that, but then the people who allow them to allow it to happen. The Tories, not just the Tories, because some in the Labour Party, unfortunately, are every bit as bad. But for me, and I want to mention a bit about, because you talk about the global south, but even what had happened to Greece earlier on, when Greece were literally, instead of offering Greece, and I had some time at the time, I have to say, for Varoufakis and his arguments as the finance minister, and putting the rest of them to shame in terms of what they could have done to help Greece. And you talked about how the global south is just facing more indebtedness that it will never get out of. And even you'd think from a capitalist short-term point of view, that they would try to enable and facilitate these countries to pay back some of the money they owe, rather than continually just crippling them to the point where they destroy their entire infrastructure. So it's like capitalism is hopefully creating its own demise, but the problem is that it is destroying the health and well-being of mainly poor working class people as it does it. So, I mean, I have to say that I'm very proud for that reason that NIPSA has within its constitution the call for a socialist economic model, because, I mean, let's be honest, I mean, you know, and I said, I agree with you that that we do have the resources and the wealth and so on in society to do all of the things you said: eliminate world hunger, eliminate poverty, give everybody the energy they need, but not under capitalism. I mean, let's, you know, because, you know, let's be honest, we have to change a system that has inequality built in, has the rich, you know, getting richer. But I mean, I'm hopeful because, I mean, you mentioned Chile. If we look at Nigeria at the minute, Nigeria, which probably is one of the biggest working class in Africa, a strong working class with solid traditions and good trade union history, and you know, have taken on colonialism and all of that. But then you look at the illusions and people like Buhari who came to power with visions that he was going to do stuff. You know, workers believed him, and now he's presiding over the biggest mess, social and economic mess in that country. He's made ethno-religious conflict worse, trampling on democratic rights. But I see the workers in Nigeria fighting back, and it's heartening that, you know, that in a situation where it's often desperate, those workers are fighting back. So I'm hopeful that, you know, that we can do this, and I think it's incumbent on us as trade unionists in the West, relatively well off, that we have to reach out the hand to trade unionists who are fighting oppression in all parts of the world, because it's a life and death issue. It really is a life and death issue, not just for the climate, which you quite rightly said is sad, but also because even if we get through this pandemic, and I hope all of us do, there's another one around the corner, and we will probably be economically, socially, for all the reasons, unless we get rid of capitalism, we will be in a much worse state by the time the next pandemic comes. And on that very depressing note, well, it's an optimistic note. It's an optimistic note that I believe that, you know, the workers of the world will unite and fight back, and we will dump this rotten system once and for all.
Thank you. Thanks, Carmel. Asad, do you want to take that, or do you want to take? There's also Dooley, who's another staff member in the union who also wants to come in. Do you want to take both and then respond, or yeah? So Dooley, do you want to go next?
Thanks very much, Otto, and again, Asad, thank you very much. I agree with Carmel's point. At the end of your contribution, I felt myself going to clap my hands, and then realised I'm sitting in a room of my own. So with the camera off, but look, thanks very much. Your contribution was excellent. Carmel has maybe covered certainly one of the main point that I wanted to was in relation to political change and the questions around political change. And I mean, I don't dispute that there are areas where workers are coming together and fighting back against corrupt governments and the capitalist system. But I might not necessarily be as hopeful that that's as widespread as what it could be. But my question, I suppose, is does the current climate situation provide us with enough time to make that political change before it's too late? Thank you.
And there's Chris has one more question. Do you want to take that as well, Sad, or do you want to respond to the two before?
I'll take that as well.
Okay, Chris, go ahead, and then
okay. Thank you. Just another highlight on the youth issues. Suppose we're the ones that will be inheriting all this mess, and while the economy and social injustice and all is immediate, suppose all the targets and all are about 2050. One of the areas I wanted to talk about was energy, and how does War and Want campaign around those issues? Are your views in accord with the Paris Agreement and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or do you have your own transition methods? You talked about energy before and how we try and balance the demand due to double by 2050, but also reduction. So if you could outline sort of what your campaigning areas are on that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So Carmel, thank you for your contribution. And I look at you know, I'm always reminded, you know, when you read the founding, you know, sort of statements of the trade union movement, you know, it always said those two things, right? You know, that the role of the trade union was to fight at this moment to better, you know, the lives and conditions of working people, but also to strive for a world, you know, that was different and just. And I think that's, you know, that's why very much the DNA of War and Want, we do that as well. And why we're such, you know, we come out of the labour movement with that vision. You know, we have to fight for where we are at, but also articulate the goal of the vision of what we want. And I think for a long time, you know, we've not been able to, I think, just generally as progressive people, right? Because we've been pushed so back in terms of fighting on each defensive fight, that if you said to people, describe the world that you want, many people find it really, really difficult. They think that that's like, oh, that's just like an imagination, rather than actually we can, you know. So when we call for public services here, we should be able to say, we want an NHS here, and we want an NHS for everybody else. We want a living wage here. Actually, we also want living wage through our supply chains and for other workers, and try and rebuild the solidarity between people. And I'm a great believer that that's the starting point for most people, right? It's bashed out of us at times, but we have automatically have solidarity with others. The problem is that the right's argument is, you know, your solidarity is within a very narrow set of people, right? The walls and fences, it's within your tribe, it's within this set of people, rather than it being global. And that's where the climate crisis does, and the corona pandemic has ripped open that argument, because these are global issues. How do you deal with them in the nation state? You just can't. And you can't escape from them. Yeah, you might delay them, but you can't escape. Even if you shut down your borders, you could still not be able to escape the fact that there is a global pandemic going on. So I think there are an opportunity for us to, as I said, rebuild that global vision and in solidarity. On the question of, does it provide us enough time? Look, you know, before War and Want, I used to lead Friends of the Earth International's work on climate. And so I used to be at the UN climate talks. I spent over a decade leading the climate justice movements, working with many of the countries of the global south. In 2009 now in Copenhagen, when the first big climate summit happened, poorer countries were arguing that we have to aim for keep temperatures below 1 degree. And the European Union and rich countries were saying 2 degrees. And poorer countries are saying, look, we are already seeing what the impact is. There is no safe level. There is no safe level because it's already impacting on food production and displacement of people, etc., on extreme weather. We can already see it. And of course, it took us to breach the 1.1 degree before everybody suddenly realized, because it moved from being like, that's a bunch of people at the UN and scientists and governments, to something that most of us could feel and see, because we can see it now tangibly. Is there enough time? Well, I take the view that, every moment we fight and every degree that we stop makes a material difference, because it's calculated, for example, that every 0.1 degree of warming leads to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. And now we're talking about 1 in 30 people will be displaced from their homes within the next 20 to 30 years. That's an immense movement of people, incredible. So whatever we do is important. Whether we are able to, have that transition as fast as we can, I would love to. And as War and Want, for example, we've done a study on what the UK's fair share would be, and said if the UK was just doing its own fair share of the carbon budget, to keep temperatures below 1.5, it would need to be at 0 by 2030. And it would have to provide $1 trillion in finance to the global south, because the UK has already consumed twice as much as it should of the carbon budget. Now, we know, I mean, that's a challenge, but it's not impossible, because when we look at moments in history, we see that when transition happens, it can happen in the most incredible way. And I don't want to use the war analogy, but we started the Second World War flying biplanes. We ended it with jet aeroplanes, right? So we know that there is, if as a world we were committed to a massive transition, we could meet that. We could really meet it. And what we're lacking is not the technology, it's the political will. That's always been the question, that do governments act in our interests, or are they acting in the sort of interests of more powerful vested economic interests? And we know that they've all overwhelmingly been acting in the interest of corporations. But there is now a countervailing force, and that countervailing force is having impact. The fact that in the US, you're having a conversation where there is a movement calling for a Green New Deal, that the Sunrise Movement is mobilizing countless number of young people, that it has, there's never been a US election where climate has ever been featured. It has become, I think, increasingly, that is building. The question is going to be, I think more importantly, will be like, what tools do they use, right? Is it going to be something that's socially beneficial to all of us, or will it be like, hoping for some technological miracle, like sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, or doing some madcap thing like, pouring iron filings in the sea and things like that? And that's what we're fighting. So I think we are, our goal is 2030, but we have to be, but what makes that goal realistic is the power of our movements. And that's why the movement of movements and building our collective power is such an important part of both War on Want strategy and the work we do with our partners. Now, in the Paris Agreement, I was also very key in terms of we pushed the 1.5 degree target into the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement says two things, right? The Paris Agreement says, we've got to aim for 2, but but the goal is to limit temperatures below 1.5. The problem is, what's happened to the Paris Agreement is what's happened to our economy globally. Because instead of a science-based regulatory system, what was put in place was voluntary. Just do what you can when you can. And so we're now headed towards at least a 3 degree warming. If all of the pledges that are put together, we're heading towards 3 degrees. So yes, in the Paris Agreement, we believe in the Paris Agreement, but we believe that there should be scientific targets, that they should be legally binding, and they should be done in a fair share approach. And that what we should be doing is not only looking at mitigation, how do we change away from our energy systems, but the adaptive measures. And the adaptive measures are, how do we guarantee people food? The adaptive measures are, how do we make sure we've got public services, etc. Do we have a solution to that? Well, we work a lot with frontline communities against extractivism, and we've always argued, look, the answer isn't going to be in electric batteries, right? The idea that, you can shift a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy is just daft. It's not possible. Because we have to reduce energy, we have to make it more efficient, and then we have to So what we should be doing is not saying, let's build 3 million more electric cars. What we should be calling for is free public transport, renewable energy transport. We should be looking to invest in social transport systems. We should be looking to invest in warm homes. We should be retrofitting each home. There are lots of other systems. So we've done a report recently with communities in Chile, for example, who, is one of the countries that is going to be most affected by this new wave of mineral and metal extraction. It's not just the rare earths and minerals, because sometimes you hear, it's about lithium and cobalt. And of course, it is about those rare earth minerals, and just to meet existing energy need of a country, we need to find 400 times the amount that is currently available in the world. So somewhere or another, we've got to find and explore and get more. But it's also all the copper and the iron ore that is needed. Now, there are communities that have been told, yes, the devastation that you're going to see is needed for this green transition. So we've been talking about actually what does a real just transition look like without the use of more metals and minerals. And it is possible to do that. We could talk about circular economies. We could talk about economies that reuse the materials that we've already out there. We're currently, a sustainable level of metal and mineral and material use in the world is about 50 billion ton each year. The earth can regenerate that. That's possible. We're at about 80 billion tons. The OECD has said, you know, the Organization of Economic, I forgot what the C stands for, development, which is the rich country club, countries club. They've said that material use is going to go to up to 180 billion tons within the coming decades. That's way beyond the ability of the planet. And so when we talk about climate as breaching, you know, the limit, it's just one. We're breaching the limit on materials. We're breaching the limit in terms of on where I think of the critical sort of 9 planetary limits, we're at close to a breaching nearly 7 of them. So it does mean thinking about the economy in a very, very different way. It's not about more extraction. Actually, it's thinking about what do we have? How do we use it better? So I'm very much always in the favor of, when we talk, we're not talking to people about less. And I think this is a mistake that often people say to people, this transition is going to be, you'll have to have less. And I think we're talking about better. This transition is going to give you a better life because it's going to give you warm homes, it's going to give you free public transport, it's going to give you a shorter working week, it's going to give you a living income, it's going to give you all the things that you need to have a dignified life. And it's been able to portray that. So going back, Chris, so our energy demand, we have very, very clear. We say, that's not the answer. The answer isn't the metal mineral exchange. We work with lots of other movements, and we've done incredible plans about how you would do community energy and would deliver energy needs for the energy poor around the world. And it would be decentralized energy systems, but you would also need to regulate the amount of energy that's being extracted. And at the moment, none of that is happening, right? We're the current energy of just fossil fuels, let alone the minerals and metals, we could burn the planet between 3 to 5 times over. And yet since Paris, we've invested 1.2 trillion in more fossil fuels and 2.2 trillion in more destructive mining extraction. So banks, corporations are still banking on that's the quick profit. And that, of course, is because corporations have as their singular goal profit maximization and shareholder dividend. That's why it's war on want. We campaigning at the moment, we're campaigning in Geneva together with the ITUC and with trade unions for binding regulations on companies, saying they must be made legally liable, not just for their social, environmental and economic impacts. So they are liable for when workers' rights are exploited. They are liable for the environmental damage that they've done. Because at the moment, you know, what they do is they socialize the damage to us as citizens, and they maximize the profit back to their own shareholders, and which is why we're unable to break that model of, which is ultimately neoliberalism. Going back to Carmel's, yes, you know, it's our economic system. Some people say that our economic system is failing. I'd say it's not failing. It was set up to do this. If you look through history, how our economic system has been set up, you can go right back to slavery. It was set up to exploit resources and people, and that's of the global north and the global south. And each iteration has just reiterated that exploitative nature in a new manifestation. We have to prevent the next one, because the next one is going to be, you know, as Naomi Klein talks about it, disaster capitalism.
Okay, thanks Asad so much. Does anyone have any last? I mean, we're drawing up on an hour and a half, so it's probably best to try and round it out there. That we're recording, as you know, and this video will be shared far and wide. So hopefully we can get this video shared throughout the union and on social media as well. But I think, is there anything that we can do, or anyone watching this can do directly? Is there anything like a newsletter that War on Want does that we could sign up to, or is there what should we come away from with? We had one thing to do. Asad, what would you say the one thing we should do is? Directly after this meeting.
So, I mean, I would call on you all, if you're not members of War on Want, to join, and if you've not signed up to War on Want as a supporter to get our information and act in solidarity with people, please do. I will try and type it into the chat box. So if you're not, Geraldine has all of those details. But I want to end on a positive note about the second thing that we can do. So we're about to launch our Global Green New Deal campaign. So hopefully NIPSA will be a partner in that. But all of us collectively, in 2021, the UK is hosting the G7 summit, which will talk about what the global recovery is going to be. And it's hosting the COP26 summit, which will talk about the climate crisis. It's an opportunity for us, really, on behalf not just of the UK, but globally, to make sure that we don't enter those two summits with just empty calls for action, but with concrete demands that involve and build. So I would say that part of what NIPSA can do in terms of this is also engage other unions across the north of Ireland and the Republic, is, you know, connect with all of these movements, because that's what we've got to build our collective power.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. For everyone who is wondering, if you're at the bottom of the screen, there's a little thing called reactions, and if you click reactions, you can click a little hand clap. So it is possible, even in Zoom, to applaud. But look, Asad, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Geraldine, who put in all the work of getting this organized, and I'm sure this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I'll commit right now to signing up to joining War on Want and trying to be more active and aware. But Geraldine, do you have anything you want to maybe just close with before we say goodbye to each other for now?
Indeed, Adam, thank you so much indeed for inviting me in to say a few final comments. As said, all's left for me to say really is to say that NIPSA cherishes its long-standing relationship and solidarity with War on Want. We really do. And I want to thank you on behalf of NIPSA for what was, once again, a very educational, compelling and inspiring presentation. And we will be looking to support your new Green New Deal campaign that's going to be launched hopefully soon, as you mentioned. So please keep us posted about that, and whatever we can do to support that campaign, we will certainly do so. So once again, thank you so much for being here today with us, and thank you all for coming along and joining this event. We really appreciate your attendance and your contribution, so thank you all.
Good luck, everybody.